Welcome back to Taiwan versus the world. Today we will hear a feature on why Taiwanese people feel so close to Japan, drawing on a range of valuable sources. But first, this week's interview. We'll return to the topic of society resilience in Taiwan, and this time with an original twist, as two guests explain how they used a tabletop game similar to a war game to better understand how resilience actually works. So I would ask you both first to introduce yourself.
Sure. Maybe I will go first. Hi, thanks for having us. And my name is I-Chen Liu. I am one of the co-founders of the Frontline Democracy, where we are a civil society initiative that dedicated to strengthen Taiwan's whole of society resilience. And we utilize a wargaming or tabletop exercise as one of the main methodologies to conduct our work. And we also do advocacies for better whole society defense policies.
My name is Cheng Xu, and I'm the co-founder of Frontline Democracy with I-Chen. And for now, I'm working in the government. My work was mainly focused on the whole of society resilience. But before I worked in the government, I was a student movement activist. So I am highly concerned about the civil society issue, and I want to make progress when country are discussing about the security issue that while we want to keep our democracy.
Thank you. So before we enter the topic of the research you have done, maybe it would be a good thing to remind people what exactly we mean by whole of society resilience.
Yeah, and I think the whole of society resilience was transferred from Western countries such as United States or the European countries. Firstly, there are two ideas. One is for whole of society, and another one is for resilience. For resilience, is much more easier to explain. It means about people, organization, or country to intimidate from the disaster or any emergency, so they can adapt the effect and response and recover. But for the whole of society, that means uh, a policy approach that would like to coordinate not just from government but also private sector and civil society uh, to approach to a common policy goal. And so Taiwan transfer these two concepts and add the defense factor in, so they make the Taiwan's whole of society defense resilience. And for me, it was a part of the defense policy.
And if I am correct, official policies about whole of society defense has been implemented by the incumbent administration in Taiwan, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. So just editing on that. So I think despite that, Taiwan implemented the whole of society defense resilience, and the president also has established related committee to promote such defense policies. But I think the thing that inspired our work is exactly that we see there's a gap between these policy and also the actual civil actions. So we want to fill in this gap by combining the tabletop exercise with capacity building toward targeting the civil society actors and ensure that the civil society members in Taiwan in a time of crisis can actually work and respond to the potential crisis. That's what inspired our work.
And so you mentioned that you are using a tabletop game. Uh, can you tell us more about this? Because we know there are such games used for military defense and to learn from them on how to defend Taiwan better militarily, like every country does that. But how does that look like when you are doing this for whole of society defense?
Sure. So The way we use tabletop exercise as a methodology is less conventional as the one used by different sectors. So our imagination and thinking is that in the time of crisis, especially in the context of war, civil societies will deal matters in a way that's very different from how they are conduct advocacies or how they are doing their, whether that's human rights work or promoting renewable energy, etc. So the way they work will be very different. But in the past, there hasn't been tabletop exercise or very specific scenario-based predictions for the civil society actors to let them know how their work would look like when an invasion or war actually breaks out. So our tabletop exercise is designed to put civil society members in a scenario of a blockade and also in the scenario of a invasion to figure out what would that look like. So for example, for the people who are having the background of, for example, cybersecurity or civic tax, we would design scenarios for them to let them know, for example, there's a power shortage or there's internet disruptions. And then they will need to rethink their strategies and how their work evolve with these different conditions and indicators that has been given to them based on our understanding of how a war would look like for civil society members.
I see. And then when you conducted these tabletop games, I know that in general, war games like this are designed so that you would lose them, so that you learn something out of defeat. So what did you learn out of these games?
I think one surprising us is about high agency but low institutional integration. So for recent years, we have read so much articles about Taiwanese commitment to our self-defense, but in this war game, we found out that almost our participants are highly willing to join to defend our country. But one thing we found out is that they, as we mentioned before, previously, that they know too less about how the war would happen, what's going on, and the different stages. So we found out that they have high agency, but for now, government still not have figured out the institutional integration for civil society. And because of this kind of situation, we found out that there's still been a unidirectional command from the government, since the civil society has no tools to respond to the policy. So for now, the policy would still be restrict on the government side. So makes the command would be one direction.
I think I can add a little bit more on how what we learn is based on who we invited to the wargaming, right? So in our first tabletop exercise, we invited two kinds of civil society members in the wargaming. One group is the usual suspects, or the people who are working directly involving the whole of society resilience defense. These people are fact checkers, hybrid threat experts from civil society, cybersecurity experts, civil defense practitioners, etc. These people are already developing their own projects, to deal with the threat of war, and has the first-hand experiences of conducting projects to increase the resilience on their end. The second group that we invited is the people who normally known as the human rights workers, or the people who works on topics that are less related to defense or whole society resilience. These people can be migrant worker or labor rights advocacies, the civil society organizations working on promoting renewable energies, or sustainable, ESG, etc., or even digital rights activists. So these people are not normally integrated or invited to tabletop exercise or war gamings. But from our perspective, we believe they are still a crucial part to maintain the function of society, since as for now, they are still very vibrant and active members in Taiwanese societies, and that's part of things that people are very proud of. But they are not traditionally invited in the preparation of war. So we want to invite both groups into our first tabletop exercise. And the thing we learn relating to these two groups will be very different and very, very interesting. I think especially when it comes to the group that is less invited or less included in the preparation of a potential war, I think this provide a great opportunities for us to do capacity buildings from them and also understanding what is their needs and impact. For example, I think one thing we learned is that actually a lot of this group doesn't really have a plan B if some of their male workers are conscripted in the scenarios of war. So I think using this tabletop exercise, we actually bring these scenarios to them and force them to think about what would actually happen, which I think in the past, people doesn't really throw these questions at them, so they don't feel the need to come up with advanced plannings to counter these potential risks. Although they are very enthusiastic in dealing with this and developing their own projects or plannings in the face of war, but in the past there was no such opportunities. This tabletop exercise that we have developed and conducted with the Taiwanese civil society members really highlight that there's huge potentials for more systematic inclusions for having civil societies in the whole of society defense. But right now, I think there's a lot of agencies that is yet to be explored or coordinated among government officials and also civil society members.
That's very interesting. And I was reading here the report on the key findings that you made with this exercise. And you mentioned also social trust. And when you talk about social trust, you talk about the risk of mismanagement of information. So, can you tell me more actually about the concept of social trust and about the way the information should be streamlined or good information be favored and misinformation being excluded? How do we fight that?
So I think we identified social trust as one of our core findings or core elements of our findings. The reason for that is that I think the way Taiwanese societies can be operational and maintaining so well right now is exactly due to social trust. For people who are not familiar with Taiwan, I think Taiwan has a weirdly high social trust where people are very willingly to help each other. That is, for example, evident in the last typhoon when it hit Hualien in the eastern part of Taiwan. A lot of people are volunteering to help people for stress relief, etc. So I think that kind of social trust will be very crucial if Taiwanese societies are facing a greater threat compared to typhoon today, which is a blockade or a kinetic war. In those scenarios, the members of the societies will need to step up more to actually fill in the gaps where governments cannot do. And there will be a lot of gaps. In this tabletop exercise, we identified that there are a lot of things that when war breaks out, governments will not be able to do like so perfectly as the way it is right now. For example, the distribution of resources, the communication gap that you mentioned. A lot of things will have gaps, and that's when civil societies will need to step up and fill in those gaps. But the reason that they are doing that is because there's a very strong social trust among them, and that's why they're able to do that. But if there is a disruptions on information transferring or trusted source of information, or they are being disrupted by information campaigns, then the losing that kind of social trust will enable the civil society members to actually fill in those gaps. So that's why we also highlight that these information gaps needs to be dealt very carefully and have advanced plannings in order to fill in these gaps. For example, in our findings, a lot of people actually highlighted that we might need to think about some low-tech solutions to transfer information, whether that's through just microphone or even just personally reach out to your neighbors. But these transferring this information around and passing the information around so that the social trust can be maintained will be one of the crucial elements to maintain a functional society and also the resilience to keep that society working. Maybe over to Tim to see if there's anything else Tim would like to add. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm happy that I-Chen mentioned about the Hualien typhoon because since the last typhoon in Hualien, there's no serious criminal during the typhoon. So it shows that Taiwanese are highly cooperated to the law. But for the wartime scenario, the government control might not be the peacetime. So, and for the sociology perspective, I see the whole society defense was a approach for government to mobilize the society, but it based on the social trust that it needs our people to believe that we are a community. So if this kind of sense of community breaks, that people might reluctant to follow the rules or volunteer to help. So it makes government struggle on just even to maintain the order. So I think social trust was a key for every aspect that we can function our society.
Now, I see you mentioned the use of low tech. How would that work in practice? Because how do you make people do this? Do we even still have this technology? Do we even have still radio that cannot be blurred or parasited? Do we even have the print to make those leaflets? How would that work in practice?
I think all the examples you mentioned has also been mentioned by the participants in our tabletop exercise. I think low-tech solutions, meaning that if the subsea cables are really being cut off, and then people will find every means possible to make sure that the trusted information coming from the government will be distributed to everyone, to every member of the societies. So printing leaflets or having that kind of printer is mentioned by the participants. In our current local county systems, I think there are smaller sets of governance models where county mayors or smaller sets of local leaders will need to act as the key members for passing those information on. And luckily, we also have one of these kind of local leaders participating in our tabletop exercise as well. So we also recognize that it's very important to keep the existing framework going on so that each components in the current governance framework can act as part of the information chain to pass on the trusted information from the government. But this will bring out another point which has been flagged by the participant is that this chain of passing informations in our current governance models and the civil society members are actually already out of capacity. They are overworked with enormous amount of different tasks that has been assigned to them in the time of war. So shedding their workload will actually be a very important factors for those whether low-tech solutions or passing around information to be possible. That's one thing we have identified. I think that's very worth sharing as well, is that these people are not lack of means to pass on information or do their work in a time of crisis, but a lot of them does not have enough capacities. They're already being assigned too much work, or their capacity will be massively reduced due to conscriptions or other factors. And that's the thing that we need to consider to create redundant capacities for them.
And what would you say actually is the biggest danger to whole of society resilience? Because we are here talking about how you work to create it. We know the government wants to create it. So if we're aware of it, of course, China is aware of it as well, and they are preparing themselves to counter it. So what do you think is the biggest threat to whole of society resilience?
I think the most dangerous one was China would definitely observe what Taiwan is going on. But I think tricky is that Taiwan was a democracy society. So if the government want to make policy change, they must make sure that people are familiar with it and get approval of it. So for me, the most dangerous one is that not just about the military action or our information would be China know our information. It was the civil society still in the confusion about this kind of issue. War and security are highly politicized topics. So government feels that they need to be extremely careful about what they say, because any signals can trigger political controversy and market reaction or public anxiety. So this kind of caution is understandable for me, to everyone. But the side effect is that the civil society often gets very little concrete information, that people don't clearly understand what risk look like and what disruptive might happen or what role they are expected to be. So as we mentioned in our report to the government, that the need is the common operation picture for everyone to join, to engage, to be the role they need to be. So when society doesn't understand the risk or what the role they need to be, the public engagement will stay very limited. So preparation remains very concentrated inside the government. So this kind of gap between political caution and public awareness is what I see the most dangerous one. So not because just people don't care, but they didn't know how to engage to join. So for democracy and autocracy, I think to be more open was only the benefit for civil society, for our democratic society to defend ourselves. We need people to know how to prepare, how to defend, and how to join. And for the most important part that we mentioned in our report, that when people get to know the issue, they can push the government to be better prepared.
I think what Tim said about not having a common operating picture is really the most crucial systematic risk that we have identified. If there's like one takeaway for this podcast, I think I will focus on that in order to make sure that the whole of society resilience can actually work, and that the civil societies can step up in in the threat of war, is to really have that common operating pictures in advance, so that people identify what are the impact to their organizations and the work they are doing while they are maintaining the function of the society. Two is to let them come up with their own action plans and coordination mechanisms among themselves. Without that, without doing all those in advance, things will be very tricky and could be very dangerous. The third one is we need more people to map out the systematic risk together. Otherwise, if we don't have enough expertise or mapping out systematic risks together, then our adversaries will abuse that and attack us on our weakest point. So not having that kind of common operating pictures is really, really dangerous. We can not only rely on civil societies to freestyle to in the moment of crisis. We really need them to do these coordination, preparations, and risk mapping in advance.
Thank you very much. And then I would like to ask you then, what can be done? Not only the government, but just civil society actors. What can we do to improve this? Anybody, any random person, not necessarily someone in government. What can we do to help whole of society resilience?
I think the first thing is, of course, to have the mindset of whole of society. I remember there's a very interesting study from Pew Center where it conducted a survey on asking Taiwanese what's their source of meaning in life. And one interesting about that is the majority of Taiwanese people actually reported their source of meaning is society, not children, not friends, but society. And I think that's a very important mindset. But when you put people in very extreme scenarios, sometimes that mindset will get lost. And we actually have observed this trend in our top exercise as well. There are individual groups who identify themselves more as focusing on self-preserving and focusing on the well-being among their groups, but less on coordinating and collaborating with other civil society members to maintain the function of the entire society. There are individual groups that has expressed such tendencies in our tip-top exercise. And I think it's very interesting to see that will happen, but also understandable in a way. So I think one of the things is, of course, to make sure that they understand the only way that we can overcome this is that we deal with this threat and dealing with this risk together. So not only on, preserving the well-being among your own groups, but also actively engaging and in conversation with other groups, both in preparations and also actions in the time of crisis. The second things I would like to flag is that I think right now, from the government side, we see more centralized approach in whole society resilience planning. And on the civil society side, it's more fragmented and everyone else developing their own project. But right now, there's a lack of coordination mechanisms between different actors. And coordination really takes some efforts so that people don't duplicate their work, they don't reinvent the wheels. But we will need one role to step out and do these coordinations so that people will know what to do in a time of crisis.
Yeah, and for me, the most important thing that people can contribute is simply understanding more, because for about a few years before, after the Ukraine war, one military think tank expert was exchanged with me that they found out that the why Ukrainian people could stay fighting was because of they believe they could win. This kind of sense of win, they maintain the willingness of people to join. So I think this is where I see the democracy really matters, since because of different from China in Taiwan, a democratic society, that we need to mobilize people or by their willingness to join. So the more civil society understand about the risk, the planning and trade-off, the better we can push government, we can push the civil society to join and ask government to improve the plans. So in our exercise, we saw that when information was limited, the preparation becomes very centralized inside the government. That's because there's no informed partner of government to work with. So when civil society knows more, civil society could ask better questions. It can point out blind spots. It can civil society can stress test themselves before a real crash happens. So this kind of pressure could actually make through all the society to bring our society to be more resilient. So beyond that, the people outside the government can prepare themselves or their organization and community to function under the disruption. For example, how to share information, how to support vulnerable groups, and how to keep basic service running, maybe on typhoon or on an earthquake. So none of these replace the role of the state, but in the democracy, resilience improve when the preparation is shared, debate, and refined in public. But for the most easy ways that maybe people just need to get to take self-rescue or first aid lessons so they can help themselves or just help their family or friends.
In just one word, what is the thing that Taiwan does the best for civil society resilience?
For Taiwan done the best, I think, is that we are willingness to try a new approach, which was the whole of society defense. Because for not so far before that, Taiwan was still on the white terror, on the martial law. So in that kind of period, the government enhanced the security issue by controlling the society and make everyone obeying the rules. But for this time, I believe it would, and I expect it would be different. That when country pursuing security, not by the law enforcement, but by letting people know more about the situation and willing to share, to exchange, to coordinate with the civil society. I think this kind of approach that government would like to try, and they make a very important step at first. So for me, the best thing that Taiwanese government done yet is their willingness to try a new approach, not the old way, but the new one.
The Taiwan-Japan relationship has been heavily commented on recently, but it goes deeper than politics, and that is striking considering that most countries in the region share some degree of animosity toward the former imperial power. Jakub Janda from the European Values Center for Security Policy explains.
As we all know from public polls, the Taiwanese society very much appreciates and positively likes Japan in general and Japanese culture, which is obviously relatively unique given the regional context, because many other societies in basically in Asia have obviously difficult and hard memories of what Japan did to them in decades ago, and not always have these grievances been, let's say, repaired and apologized for. But in terms of Taiwan, this is not an issue. Let's say there is no real historical grievance which would be present in the Taiwanese society today. So at the society level, let's say on a cultural level, people to people level, you could very much say that those are nations, I mean Taiwanese, Japanese nations are very close to each other in terms of how they see each other, how, let's say, they are visiting each other in terms of tourism or work-related migration as well. So in that case, it's quite similar to each other. I mean, I come from Czech Republic, and I would argue that to some extent it's similar to how Czech Republic and Slovakia are very much close to each other. Obviously, Japan and Taiwan are slightly different. They have different language, but in terms of closeness, it's very much close to each other.
Stephen Nagy, an analyst based in Japan, tells us more.
So when we think about Japan and Taiwan's colonial history, I think the first 5 years or maybe 10 years of Japan's colonial rule was arguably rough or difficult for those people that were on Taiwan at the time. But the Japanese soon started to give the same rights and build the same schools and build roads and build hospitals for Taiwan. And they taught Taiwanese, Japanese like they taught ordinary Japanese citizens Japanese. So from the Taiwanese perspective, the Japanese colonial rule was nothing like the colonial rule the Koreans experienced or what mainland China experienced. They experienced order, they experienced education, hospitals, schools. And when the Japanese were defeated in 1945 by the Americans and they withdrew, it was at that particular time the Republican government headed by Chiang Kai-shek took over Taiwan and mainland China. And eventually they came back and they ruled Taiwan with an authoritarian hand until really the 1980s. So Japan's rule as a colonial power is seen rather favorably by Taiwanese. And they've always looked to Japan and the archipelago of Japan as advanced, cultural, civil, well-mannered, polite, sophisticated. And it's something that I think the Taiwanese people have that really resonates with the Taiwanese people's mind and hearts and their attitudes about life.
I think one of the key reasons is that Taiwanese recent or modern history of the 20th century has been obviously traumatized by the White Terror, by all the wars with communist China as well. That comparatively to it, what Japan did during World War II in Taiwan is not seen as kind of so intensive for today's affairs, which is obviously very different if you compare it to the South Korean case or the Chinese case, what Japan did there, and how it's being used for today's politics. But in terms of Taiwan, I think this is one of the reasons. Second reason, there is definitely that, let's say, the Japanese society is actually very openly friendly to Taiwan, which I would say is relatively unique in the context, right? Because you could see Japan being quite a close society in terms of migration issues or culture as well in the whole region. But to Taiwan, there is a long-term sympathy, which has been emphasized by essentially many leaders in Japan, not only the prime ministers, but there are, as you could see in Taipei, there are dozens of Japanese parliamentarians visiting Taiwan regularly, which only shows the closeness of the I would say, cultural and political ties. And while the, let's say, military defense cooperation is I mean, happening behind closed doors, it's not happening very visibly, but most of these connections are, I would say, up and running, and it's a very dynamic relationship in terms of basically the positivity or synchronicity of this.
In Taiwan, affection towards Japan is often stronger than resentment over the colonial era, which ended with Japan's defeat in World War II. This contrasts sharply with South Korea, which share a similar history. Professor Ingyu Oh of Kansai Gaidai University explains why.
From the 1940s to the 1980s, there was a heavy dose of anti-Japanese imperialism education by KMT to all Taiwanese people, regardless of whether you are from Taiwan or from mainland. And at the time, that the level of anti-Japanese education was similar in its dosage, I think, to that of Korean education. So I remember several Japanese scholars asking the question that how come both KMT and the Korean Park Chung-hee regime both instilled heavy dose of anti-Japanese sentiment or mentality to their kids. How come Taiwanese people are different from the Koreans now? Things have changed, I think, in Taiwan from the 80s because there's more freedom of expression. There was more organization on the grassroots level against KMT dictatorship. And I think Jiang Jingguo was a very weak guy in making his father's legacy palpable to the new generation of Taiwanese people who were very angry about the KMT rule for the obvious incident of the massacre, and also Taitu movement that was taking enough steam and energy not only in the street level but also abroad, island-wide impact. Here, I think Taiwanese people have realized that the education itself was very faulty, very wrong in its intentions, because in fact Japan should be Taiwan's ally, because Americans aligning with Japan for many years, and they are developing together like that. They are prosperous together. In Asia, Japan is the only wealthy nation in Asia, and that's the only market we have. That's the only technology source we have for Taiwanese people. I think they were gradually realizing that. That was very fast for Taiwan because it's also a survival game for them, where there's no direct U.S. military commitment to the island. The Korean case is a little bit different because Korea has maintained strong U.S. military commitment since 1950. So Koreans were not really worried about immediate collapse or immediate threat from North Korea. So at the same time, the dictator Park was very close to the LDP politicians. And although he used anti-Japanese imperialist rhetoric in politics, but he in fact strengthened relationship between South Korea and Japan. So in both countries, I think on the surface they were like using a very strong anti-Japanese sentiment, rhetorics and politics. The relationship between Japan and Korea, Japan and Taiwan were very strong, and at the same time, South Korea and Taiwan relationship had been very strong at the time because of KMT and the close friendship with Chiang Kai-shek and President Park Chung-in. So at that time, I would say at that time up until the 70s and early 80s, three countries, Korea, Taiwan, and Japan, were very close to each other, and we had a very similar relationship.
For many Taiwanese, seeking closer ties with Japan is also a way to further distinguish themselves from China. David Frazier, a journalist for the Japan Times, tells us more.
When I came to Taiwan in the mid 1990s, the older generation in Taiwan many of them still spoke Japanese. They had gone to Japanese schools as kids. And when Japan left Taiwan, when they relinquished possession of Taiwan at the end of World War II, Taiwan was Japan's sort of model colony. The standard of living was quite good. There was a intellectual culture, in around the island. Culture was flourishing. The Taiwanese were painting. They learned impressionist oil painting via Japan. So many of these Western ideas and concepts, like in the language and literature as well, they were going into Japan first, and then Taiwan was getting them in the 1920s, 30s, 40s. And this is sort of like really kind of a cultural development. When the KMT came, by comparison, it was viewed by many as like a big step back because here you're coming like all these peasants, they're like uneducated, illiterate, poor, abide by any rules of society. They're just sort of looting and like literally just stealing things, taking what they need. In comparison to what the KMT were offering, they looked at what the Society of Japan had created in Taiwan in a really sort of favorable light. Japan built National Taiwan University. It built all these like great universities around Taiwan, all the sort of modern institutions that allowed Taiwan to flourish later on. A lot of them really have their roots in the Japanese colonial period. I mean, even Taiwan's presidential office, was built by the Japanese for the Japanese governor of Taiwan.
Japan is and always has been an alternative to China. or alternative to non-Asia. Japan was not considered as an Asian country to young Taiwanese people. Japan is like a limbo country in between, between the West and Asia. So traditional Asia is being represented by China, whereas new Western culture is represented by America, and then in between some sort of hybridized status of Japan is where you find a very sexy and idealized mixture of both Asia and America. So in that sense, Japan has been so attractive to many young Taiwanese people from the 70s. I think it's a way to express their political will to be independent and to maintain independent from China on the one hand and maintain their independence as they now have it. So I think Japan, in that sense, it has some philosophical or symbolic meaning to many Taiwanese people.
Japan represented everything that China didn't. It was ordered, it was capitalistic, it had well manners, it was wealthy, sophisticated, safe. And in that sense, I think young Taiwanese people for more than a generation, probably several generations, always looked to Japan in a way that this is where they wanted to go. That's the direction of development that they would like to invest in. And I think young people today in Taiwan similarly feel that Japan and its lifestyle and culture and values is more representative of the values that young Taiwanese people have compared to their mainland counterparts.
And finally, Japan developed a vibrant pop culture after the war, one that reshaped its global image and played a major role in winning the affection of the Taiwanese public.
Unlike Korea, Taiwan has openly accepted the Japanese pop culture. Now, that's very funny because, on the one hand, in the classrooms, Chiang Kai-shek and KMT people emphasized Japanese imperialism, how Chinese people should fight Japanese imperialism, all that. They should not forget about history. That's one classroom in all Taiwanese public schools at the time, private schools at this. On the other hand, adults in Taiwan were allowed to enjoy Japanese movies, Japanese programs, Japanese pop culture. So at that time, Chiang Kai-shek had a policy of using popular culture to cool down, to calm down political opposition in Taiwan. So they used pop culture there. They used Japanese pop culture. They used Korean pop culture, but mostly Japanese pop culture because the manga, anime, Japanese music were so popular in Taiwan at the time. At that time, the music was not city pop kind of music or J-pop kind of, it was enka. So, for example, Teresa Tan, Deng Lunjin, Taiwanese singer, was very popular in Japan. She sang both in Japanese and Chinese. Okay, so enka was very, like a common mutual cultural understanding between Japan and Taiwan at the same time. And that was 1970s and 80s, right?
For many Taiwanese, but also Asians in general, they look to Japanese pop culture in very nostalgic ways. I think parents, people my age, they knew about Sasai-san, they knew about Doraemon, they knew about all these characters. But today, what's popular amongst young people is actually I don't know, but One Piece and all the makeup and animation and many aspects of Japanese popular culture that they can relate to. And I think again it goes back to this idea that the popular culture that emerges out of Japan is censor-free. It's an expression of the sincere feelings of ordinary people rather than the state. And this is something that I think Taiwanese people really value and want to continue to invest in rather than a state-sanctioned anime culture that we see in the mainland. Japan has many elements. In public, people follow hierarchical positions, but in private, they're much more flexible. There's a lot of creativity here as we see through manga and through the entertainment industry that reflects the flexibility of the Japanese culture and relationships. And I think that that's what makes it attractive, is that there's such a contrast between the ordinary lives of Japanese, which is quite rigid and habitual, and the out of this world characters that are portrayed in Japanese animation and films. And I think this is what makes Japan so attractive. And I think that we're going to continue to see this attractiveness be in center stage in the region, because Japan still is seen as one of the most advanced countries.
On other news around Taiwan, two of them in relations to parliamentary opposition to the military budget. Taiwan's Defense Minister Wellington Koo said Taiwanese society risks becoming numb to increasing military pressure from China, including frequent warplane and warship missions near the island. He urged stronger readiness and weapon procurement. President I-Chen reinforced Taiwan's efforts to expand economic cooperation with democracies, arguing that prioritizing these partnerships is more beneficial than deeper reliance on China. And finally, Frank Paris, the de facto French ambassador in Taipei, said that foreign naval transits through the Taiwan Straits are intended to uphold international law and navigational rights and not to provoke China, which claims the straits as its own territorial waters. We will meet again next week for a new episode of Taiwan versus the World.